Hello my friends, welcome back to another video. Sorry it's been so long. I know I say that a lot. Sorry it's been so long. Um, I guess part of the reason why it's been so long is I just really didn't know how to present the Canterbury Tales. Um, why don't I know how to present it? Well, I guess part of the problem, of course, is that, as a reader, you approach a book with your own background, right? I have a pretty decent background in history, especially medieval history and so on, and I'm getting to know literary history better and better all the time. I read Canterbury Tales about 30 years ago, and it struck me as put it this way, that my memories of it were as it was lewd, it was sort of shocking, disedifying, because I was a very serious young man, serious Christian young man, and the sexual stuff wasn't appreciated by me. Now in middle age, I view those things somewhat differently. And it's funny how the sexual content is much less than I remember it being. And so, it's such a mixed bag to say, the Canterbury Tales is like this. Well, it's a plurality. It's Canterbury Tales. It's like saying, well, what's the New York Times like? I suppose when you talk about the New York Times, you're in that way you mean what's the editorial board like, right? But maybe you read the paper for its sports, maybe you read it for its politics, for its business, for its cultural whatever part. So that's kind of what you get with the Canterbury Tales. Is it's such a mixed bag. There's those lewd and crude stories, and then there's tales of saints. There's theological treatises. There's old chivalric tales. There's stories that originate with the ancient world. I want to say Ovid or something, and then there's lots of stuff that was taken from Boccaccio, his Decameron, which was written a bit before, like a generation before Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales, Chaucer lived exclusively in the 14th century, so the 1300s, and he died before the change of the century. He was privileged to have actually gone to Italy at one point, and to have I don't know which poets he met. He might have actually met Boccaccio, I'm not sure, but he was one of the only Northern Europeans, or certainly Englishmen, who had such an acquaintance with what was going on in Italy at the time. So we mean the Italy of Boccaccio, of Petrarch, and Dante, and that means he was, from our perspective, he was very well cultured in literature. The interesting thing about English literature in the late Middle Ages was that it was, I think it's fair to say, it was dominated by French culture. So, as you know, basically the French, or the Norman French, conquered England in 1066, and this is a couple centuries later, where French is still very important. It's in England, it was kind of like a literature. It was declining in this way, but it was a literature of the educated, or the elite, I guess, not the educated. The language of the educated was Latin, of course, but of the elite, there was still a lot of French influence. Let's not forget that the dynastic ties between France and England have always been interlinked, and that explains the 100 Years' War. We think of France and England as two completely separate entities today, but the fact was they weren't in those days. The countries were not what they are today. And the ties through culture, through settlement, through the internationalism of the feudal lords, like the feudal lords owned property in different places, and the King of England, of course, as you know, was also, I guess, for a while, the Duke of Normandy, and through different dynastic ties, he had claims to the throne in France. So it was just a very different world. It's kind of like talking about France and Germany as distinct countries in the Middle Ages. France and Germany were both Frankish, German Frankish products, way back to the Frankish Empire of Charlemagne, and then the Ottonians, and then blah, blah, blah. So getting back to my essential point, it's difficult to talk about the Canterbury Tales as a single thing. Like, there's parts of it person X will like, and parts of it person A will like, and won't like other parts. So it's a real smorgasbord. Like, who reads the New York Times from cover to cover? I don't think I've ever read a sports page in my life. I've never read the business section. Sometimes, I guess the comics were always my favorite part. Of course, the front page. So that's kind of like the Canterbury Tales. It's important as basically Chaucer was really the first great English poet. I guess in many ways, like most histories of English literature would start with Chaucer. Because the fact was Beowulf and that earlier stuff was just a completely different language in many ways. And Chaucer, for as strange as he is, and he's even a little bit more difficult to read than Shakespeare, and I will put some examples of his actual writing here. So what you have here is what would you call a translation. It's not really a translation. It's more of a, I suppose, updating. And it's a little bit more, as I said, it's a little bit more rudimentary, not rudimentary. It's a little bit more old-fashioned even than Shakespeare, and it'll kind of make you laugh about how that really oldie Englishy kind of dialect that you would see in different representations. So, like, for instance, the start of the one of the tales, the Cook's Tale, for instance, reads like this: "Apprentice Willem dwelt in our city, and of a craft of victuallers was he. Gilliard he was, as Goldfinch in the Shaw, brown as a berry and proper short fella, with loches black, combed full fetisly, and dance he could so well and jollily, that he was called Perkin Revelor, and he was as full of love and paramour, as is the honeycomb of honey sweet. Well was the wenchie that with him might meet. At every bridal would he sing and hop. He better loved the tavern than the shop." Okay, so you can kind of understand what's being said there, and you might say, well, that's actually easier to understand than Shakespeare. I disagree. It's a little bit more removed from modern English than is Shakespeare. But Shakespeare, of course, was very poetic and spoke in lots of analogies and allegories and metaphors and so on, more even than Chaucer. So, like, talking in metaphors is difficult for someone to interpret from a different cultural context. So I looked up the genres because it's been like a month or so since I finished it, and so I looked up, like, anybody who even reads it quickly will realize that there is different kinds of stories in the Canterbury Tales. Some of it's serious, some of it's ludicrous, some of it's like romancy, and some of it's sort of everyday-ish or whatever. And one site, I'll give credit here, it's called Historia Delingles. it's somebody's private blog site on WordPress, I guess. They list Fableau as one of the things. I think that it's just depictions of sort of everyday life from different settings. I don't know, like mise en scène or something. You'll know it when you see it. There's chivalric romance or courtly love. For instance, The Knight's Tale is an example of that, and you'll see that very easy. You'll be able to identify that very easily. These are the stories that you would be familiar if you read any of the Arthurian romances, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or anything like that. Exemplum, that teaches a moral lesson. The Pardoner's Tale is an example of that. Beast Fable. The Nun's Priest Tale is a beast tale where where animals are the main character. That one doesn't jump to mind for me. Satire. Satire, I think, is one of the ones that English professors like to talk about the most. And having gone through university and so on, it's almost like the only thing that was ever written in the past was making fun of clergy or something. I found that to be a massive misrepresentation of the Canterbury Tales. My memory of the English literature I was taught in my undergrad was basically that everything made fun of the clergy all the time. And you know what? It's not true. Judging from the Canterbury Tales, the clergy are not really singled out any more than any other walk of medieval life. So it's not like, for instance, Erasmus's Praise of Folly, which does concentrate on the silliness or the badness of the clergy. Canterbury Tales, the clergy is just one of the people that are lampooned or whatever, satirized, right? I don't find they're more singled out than anyone else. Like anyone involved in money trade is singled out as greedy. Farmers are singled out. Tradespeople are singled out. I don't find it especially anti-clerical or anything like that, which is interesting because that's a modern preoccupation. To talk about clergy back then would be equivalent to talking about politicians today. Like, yeah, there's bad politicians and good politicians and blah, blah, blah. Actually, nobody's as critical as politicians as I am. But I've met some good people, like especially down the street there at the municipal town hall. These are decent, good people. And to make fun of them, I encounter them at the grocery store or whatever on the street, would be absurd. They're just normal people. And our priests, our clergy in this town here are normal people. And singling them out would be a sign of the critic's peculiarity. So for someone to single out and criticize the clergy in my town, you'd say, well, what's their problem? Are they homosexual? Are they some kind of strange Marxist or something? Like, that would reveal more about the critic than about the object of the criticism. Somebody who singled out the mayor and other reps in the town council here would be revealing more of himself than he would be of the municipal government, right? So the fact that Chaucer very evenly distributes his satire to clergy, to lay, to men, to women, I think is interesting and indicates his worldview and not the worldview of a feminist university professor in the 21st century. Okay, point made. Burlesque, so there is some wit, irony, hyperbole, blah, blah, blah. that's there's some buffoonery and stuff like that. It's entertaining. It's fun. It's funny. Low comedy. Low comedy focuses on ordinary folk. The Miller's Tale is given as an example of that. Breton lay. Do you remember I was talking about Marie de France reviewing her lays? That's what we're talking about here. So, for instance, Breton would be one of the northern provinces or counties or whatever in France, which was very culturally influential on England at the time, right? The Franklin's Tale is an example of that. So stuff that Marie de France, and again, Marie de France was in England and France. It's the exact same cultural setting, allegory. The Nun's Priest's Tale is an example of allegory. So those are some of the things that that website or that blog pointed out as different genres. So the fact is, it's a hodgepodge. The Canterbury Tales is a hodgepodge. Oh, I should mention, it's unfinished. This book here, which is cutting out the indices and so on, it's like 500 pages. This is only like half of what he wrote, or sorry, half of what he intended to write. And in fact, even this here, I discovered abridges or cuts out a little bit of what he actually wrote. For whatever reason, the editor here, the translator Neville Coghill, he cut out some of the moral stuff. So some of the I guess you'd say the exemplum. Yeah, the exemplum. So he cut out. I can't remember whose it was, but it was a part of a long. So one of those things like talking about saints or whatever, or talking about theological topics. The editor for some reason cut some of that out, but so I guess it was about 20 or 30 pages worth. So even what Chaucer finished, 95% of it is here, but this only represents about 50% of what he wanted to write, because he tells us in the prologue to the whole work that all these people, so the setting is, of course, the Canterbury Tales, they're on pilgrimage. Of these different people, there's 20 or 30 of them from all walks of life. They're going on pilgrimage to Canterbury, where the tomb of the guy that the king killed there. What's his name? Oh my gosh. I'll throw it in here. The name of the martyr. Not Edward the Confessor, no. The martyr who was the Archbishop of Canterbury who killed him? The king, anyway, there's a famous play about it too. Anyway, who cares? So they're going to visit the shrine of that martyr, that archbishop who was killed by the king, but because he resisted the king was trying to, I think, tax the clergy or whatever, or tax church property, and that was a big no-no. And, for instance, when Henry VIII would confiscate church territory in the early 1600s or 16th century, nobody stopped him except for, nobody really opposed him. He had a few people opposed him, like St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher, but not too many people stood up against Henry VIII. But in this case, this few centuries earlier, this archbishop stood up against the king and was killed on his account. And then the king regretted it and blah, blah, blah. So the massive hypocrisy of killing the prophets and then worshiping the prophets, right, that Jesus talks about, is the center of this pilgrimage here. So the way it was set up is these people walked. Actually, some were on horseback. The way it was set up was that they came to an agreement to entertain the travelers, to pass the time. It's a very slow process. They're not walking along modern paved highways or anything. To pass the time, each of the members of the pilgrimage party agreed to tell two stories, I guess. One on the way and one on the way back, and then they'd all vote who had the best story or something. So what we find here is only the first stories. Okay, I think there is one of the second stories that was completed. Let me see here. Yeah, the second nun's tale. Wait, is that second because she's the second nun, or second because it's her second tale? I think it's the nun's second tale. And I have a feeling that it's not even finished, that tale. So anyway, what we get here is most of the first tales. Who won, who lost, we don't know. Sort of some of the things that are interesting in the story itself is the narration that the narrator does, who I think is named as Chaucer, is named as the author. So you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think Chaucer plays the role of the guy who's writing down all these tales and filling in the spaces between the different stories. So what happens between story 1 and story 2? Well, the narrator will make some bridging comments or whatever. So within the stories, it's interesting because in some cases, stories are told as a reaction to the previous story. So for instance, one story will criticize a certain kind of person, and that kind of person from that trade will get angry and will then criticize the trade of the person that criticized their trade. Okay, so whatever, say if it was, I don't know, I can't even give an example. Let me just look at the titles here, because a lot of the titles are unfamiliar to us. Like a clerk, that's where we get our word clergy from. So a clerk could mean basically anything, but it's semi-clerical anyway. But could mean just someone in low orders who just wrote stuff, or it could mean a full-fledged priest. Wife of Bath. So it was a wife who was from the city of Bath, or I guess the town of Bath. The physician, you know what a physician is. The pardoner is something that you wouldn't know automatically. A pardoner is someone who sold pardons for sins, and he was authorized by the Pope to do so. Prioress is a nun who's the head of a community of nuns. Shipman, man of law, lawyer. Monk, I guess we know what a monk is. Nun's priest's tale. So a nun's priest. So it's a priest that was in service to the nun. Well, a nun who had a priest in service to her wasn't just your everyday nun. She was obviously an important nun, wealthy or whatever, to have her own priest, her own whatever, confessor and chaplain or whatever, right? So some of the things are obvious. A miller is someone who grinds grain. A knight, a cook. A reeve, I think a reeve is where we get the word sheriff from. So it's a shire reeve. That's where we get the word sheriff, shire reeve. So a reeve is, I think in this setting, the reeve is in charge of a certain territory or something for sake of the administration of justice or whatever. Franklin, I can't even remember what a franklin is. Squire, we can kind of figure out what a squire is. So some of these people, some of these descriptions are, it's pretty obvious what the person is and does, and oftentimes their perspective, their story comes from their personal profession in some way. It exemplifies their view of life as from their vantage point. So for me, middle-aged white dude in rural Canada, I would have my own sort of perspective, and a historian would look at me in 500 years and say, oh, isn't that interesting how that white middle class whatever dude said that, you know, the garbage tags were too expensive, or gas was too expensive, or the price of lemons is good, or I don't know, something stupid like that. That it would exemplify something of my perspective in the world. And so that's what Chaucer tried to do. He brings in all these different perspectives, which is difficult for an author. Believe you me, it's difficult for an author to take on someone else's position. But he does it really quite masterfully in some cases. And I have to tell you, my favorite story was The Wife of Baths. And I should, let me further specify. It wasn't her story as much as her prologue. Her prologue was genius. Let me look at this here now. So The Wife of Bath, her section is quite long because she has a long prologue, the longest prologue, I think, really, of any of the speakers. Her tale was not as interesting as her prologue, to tell you the truth. I thought it was so interesting because she was talking about marriage, sexuality, and so on. And I think it would be a mistake just to see her as a crude old cow who's got no what's the word I'm looking for? No gentility or whatever. She is a lusty babe, and I mean that in the old-fashioned sense of the word. She's alive and she's lusty. But what I found so interesting was her talking about marriage and so on. So interesting to me. I mean, you might not agree with me. You might say that, like so many people, when they found out I was starting reading the Canterbury Tales, they said they always singled out the which was it? And I saw later that they did so because it was one of the body tales. Now, which one was it? It was near the start. I guess the Man of Law's tale. I remember it being the second tale. Anyway, and they kept saying, "Oh, I remember this tale," and it was always the same one. And reading it, you realize, oh yeah, it's one of the body tales. Is it the Miller's Tale? The Miller's Tale. The Miller's Tale is one of the, is one of the, I guess you'd call it by the definitions here, one of the fabuloes. And yeah, the Miller's Tale is, this person considers one of the fabuloes. It's one of the bodier tales, along with, gosh, what was that one? The one with the sex in the tree. Whose one was that? The Sex in the Tree. This is the one I remember from. This is the one I remember from 30 years ago. The Sex in the Tree one. I can't remember who told this one. Doesn't matter. So there's this couple of very body stories, which are funny. Not my favorite. My favorite was, as I said, The Wife of Bath's tale, because I find it so fascinating. As you know, I think a lot about men and women, sexuality, marriage, blah, 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 stuff like that. So I found her story to be really interesting. Again, not her story, but her prologue. Is this a book for everybody? There's some boring parts, I think. Some people will find some of the parts boring. Some of the people will find some of the parts funny and good and blah, blah. Some of the people will appreciate the history that they see exemplified and will learn a lot about the time. Other people won't be able to clue into that and draw from that. So what we have here, what you're going to usually find when you pick up Canterbury Tales, you're not going to find it in the original Middle English. You're going to find it in modern English, updated. And you'll be thankful for it because it's a much quicker read. This translator did a good job, but I really don't know how hard it would be to translate this, in a sense. Like it's in poetic feet, right? Poetic meter, and not all the meters the same. Different stories and different parts have different meters, but often rhyming. And I don't think it would be very hard to carry through the rhyme. So if you're translating, like if you translated a Latin poem into English and you tried to imitate the Latin meter, that'd be very difficult. And, or say, for instance, if you translated a modern French poem, rhyming poem, into English, that'd be very hard to come up with the rhymes, because French rhymes are built up upon, well, as you know, the endings are different, and so on. Whereas for instance, a language like Latin, it's really easy to rhyme in Latin, whereas in English it's not as easy, and certainly French rhyme does not go very easily in English rhyme. But this Middle English rhyme, I think, would be kind of easy to put into modern English, because I think 50, 60, 70% of the words are our words, right? And sometimes there's a little bit of change in them, which wouldn't be too hard for a modern translator to think of a modern equivalent of, right? But it's, I don't know. You know what? I think 50% of you will like Canterbury Tales, 50% of you won't. And the people that will like it will appreciate the historical context. The people that won't like it won't either understand the history or care about the history. You might understand it, but not care about it, right? So there you go. That's Canterbury Tales in a nutshell from me. There you go. Did I do a good job, bad job? I don't know. But I don't know, read one of the tales and see if you like it. But for me, it was the bridging material that was more interesting. Some of it, you're going to see, oh, this is exactly like Marie de France, or this is exactly like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or whatever. I don't love those stories, those Arthurian stories per se. Like, you'll see some of them in Boccaccio, you'll find some of them in, you'll see parts of it in like Dante or whatever. Who else? Yeah, basically all those, the Arthurian romances from France and England in the High Middle Ages, or High Middle Ages. Anyway, thanks guys. Hope you enjoyed that. I'm reading a couple books right now. I'm reading Leibniz's Theodicy, which is a difficult book, but is extremely interesting, and I'll be happy to talk about that soon. And I'm also reading a book on natural law, which is knocking my socks off, which is so good. Okay, and we'll hopefully be able to talk to you about those soon. Thanks, guys. Hope you have a great day. All the best.